Greetings to all. My name is Kulpreet Yadav. I'm one of the co-founders and a director at World Law Alliance. We have a very interesting topic for today, and that is international labor and employment law. Key issues that global employers should know. We have a very experienced speaker. Before I introduce our speaker for today, allow me just 30 seconds to tell you what World Law Alliance is and what we do. So World Law Alliance is a modern-day integrated international practice of law and a global service delivery platform. Through the collaborative innovation of our members around the world in 80+ global locations, we deliver exceptional service, tailored advice, and practical, efficient solutions for most complex transactions, disputes, and legal issues. That brings me to today's speaker. We have Rosalind Sands with us. Here is a short biography of Rosalind Sands. Rosalind Sands is a highly acclaimed global labor and employment lawyer. She was born in Cuba, raised in America, and is currently living in Paris. She's a US and French attorney at law with over 35 years of experience. She works with clients to design and implement their global strategies with HR perspective and assist global companies to understand how to be a socially responsible corporate citizen around the world. Rosalind began her career as a lawyer in the United States before moving to France and focusing exclusively on international labor and employment law matters for multinational clients. Our session for today is approximately 1 hour. And if you have any questions, you can send it through the chat box to us. With that, may I now invite Rosalind to please start today's session.
Thank you very much, Kulpreet, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. First of all, I want to say Happy New Year to everybody. I hope everybody is safe and doing well. And I want to just emphasize that this is a conversation, so please feel free to put things in the chat or ask questions during the Q&A session. And we will do our very best to cover everything that anybody raises during this session or afterwards if necessary. So let me be actually very frank with you. I really hoped that I would not speak about COVID during this session. I actually thought that by end of January, it would be a boring topic. There would be nothing else to really talk about with respect to COVID. But the reality of our lives is that that would be unrealistic, and that would be to ignore what we are really living through today. COVID continues to dominate the landscape and invade all issues around HR legal for global companies. We can't get around it. This is not like 2008, where we had a financial crisis. We know this is a human health issue. And so it is just normal that human resources and humans in general are front and center with respect to COVID. Now, it's very important, if I can go on to the first slide, please, Gayatri. It's very important, I think, as a starter, I want to just lay the landscape down. I want to lay the landscape down in terms of what I see as being, I think we don't have the right slide up, Gayatri. Oops. Excuse me, everybody. If you can move to the first slide.
Gayatri, are you there?
Yeah. I'm on the first slide. Is it visible?
It's visible. Can you make it larger so that?
No, I don't think that's the first slide, but that's okay. I can continue without slides if we don't have the right slide up. Shall I continue, Kulpreet?
Yes, please do. Please.
Okay, please. So the first thing that I wanted us to really focus on are what we've been living through. It's very important to just get a little bit of a lay of the land in terms of what we've seen. And the ones that it is a personal perspective, so please bear with me. First of all, what we've seen is speed. We've seen the incredible way in which this virus has totally crossed around and gone around the world. Obviously, this is because of our globalization. Obviously, this is because never, ever, I think, in humanity have we had so much movement of people all around the world all the time, doing business, going on vacation. People are constantly moving. And so it should not be such a big surprise, but it is amazing how fast COVID has spread worldwide. I remember the first time I heard about Wuhan in China, and I thought, wow, it's a weird thing happening to them. But I didn't really think it would be all of us. And we see also with Omicron, since just a few months, how that has totally contaminated the entire world. So there is the issue of speed, which is because of our globalized world. The next important point for me was the abruptness and the upheaval that was caused by this virus. You know, there's a saying that says, humans plan and God laughs. So for those who don't believe in God, you can substitute that for some other thing. But the point is that here we are living our lives every day, thinking we control our lives, thinking we can decide our own destiny. And all of a sudden, the COVID button was pushed and everything just basically came to a halt. This was just an amazing thing. And sitting in Paris, I remember distinctly when the French government required everyone to be home, and you could only leave your home if you had permission, and only for 1 hour a day with a specific pass to be controlled by police that would be walking around. So it was a little bit of a feeling of an eerie police state, but everybody understood that this was necessary in order to be able to control the virus. The third point is technology. Technology really played a role here. It allowed us, at least for the non-essential workers, this new categories that we never used before, non-essential or essential workers. The reality is that it's not really about essential or non-essential workers. It's about physical presence essential workers or physical presence non-essential workers. But in any event, what we know is that technology enabled us to survive. Everybody seemed to learn overnight how to use Teams, how to use Zoom. Nobody had to go to training classes because necessity creates the desire to want to learn, and everybody had the requirement to have to learn and just be able to work in a distant digitalized environment. The next point comes more to the heart of the people listening to this webinar, which is more about HR and labor and employment laws and the constant pivoting. As Kulpreet said, I've been practicing law for a long time now, and I have never seen such velocity in the passing of labor and employment laws everywhere in the world, all at the same time. And not just one set of legislation, but constant changes to the legislation, week after week after week, almost as if the law was trying to keep up with the bouncing ball of COVID that was going through the entire world. And it was difficult. It was difficult, number one, just to keep up with the laws, let alone to find a way to comply with it. And even if at the beginning, let's say, nobody knows if anybody was really complying, but that wasn't anybody's real concern because everybody was quite concerned about staying alive. So compliance became a secondary issue at the beginning. The next point is, of course, medicine that came through with a virus with a virus vaccine in record time. So this was really something that was quite amazing. And so we see that it's been tough. We've had to really, really adjust and deal with our existence, which was kind of just thrown at us. But, you know, I'm a firm believer in Darwin and survival of the fittest, and perhaps human beings, one of our best assets is our ability to pivot and adapt and be flexible when we have no other choice. So if we had another slide, I would ask you to move on to the next slide, but I don't know whether we fixed the slide issue or not. So the real question for me when we move along is, what has COVID unleashed? Okay, now we know that the big conversation over the past 2 years or so has been, can we force people to be remote? Can we force people to come to the office? Are we responsible if they have work accidents at home? Do we have to pay for them to be at home? There are a myriad of different issues that have been talked about over the past 2 years. And some of them there's no answers to because we've never been confronted with this situation. But there's been this entire discussion around how to manage through the specific, let's say, temporary situation of actually being within the COVID time zone, let's say. But in fact, that's not really what I want to talk about. I really would like to talk about the unleashed energy of COVID, what that has created in people, and together with what that has created in people, there we go. Excellent, thank you so much. So if we can go to the next slide. The COVID years slide. Okay, I'll continue then. What COVID has unleashed, and that would be the third slide. If you can hear me, Gayatri, to make it go to the next slide. Boop, boop.
Are we on the right slide?
Go ahead to the next slide, the slide that starts with what COVID has unleashed, please.
Yeah, I'm on that. Is it now visible?
No. Okay, so let's continue despite the slide issue. So the issue is, what has COVID unleashed? Now let's try to think back, okay? We meaning most persons who have been working, we've been very, very, very busy pre-COVID. Okay? Very busy, we've been working, we've been succeeding in our jobs, we've been productive, efficient, spending time with our friends, going to the movies, making money, spending money, and perhaps believing that all of that was actually making us quite satisfied with our lives and happy. Actually, maybe we just didn't have much time to stop and really ponder whether we were doing what we actually really wanted to do. But then, as I said earlier, the COVID pause button came. And all of a sudden, we were forced, particularly the non-essential workers, let's say, to experiment with another way of living, to experiment with another way of working, okay, and living, okay? And this actually created a life that was imposed on us. And even if we didn't maybe like it at the beginning, the reality is that after a while, you start to think and you start to wonder, is this new life really good, or is this new life not good? And actually what this has created is a lot of questioning on the part of employees, a lot of questioning about, what do I really want to do with life? What conditions do I want for my job? Where do I want to work? When do I want to work? How important is it for me to have a flexible workplace and time? Do I really need somebody looking over my shoulder all the time? Or can I work in an autonomous way? Am I not independent? Don't I want to have a stress-free work environment to the extent that I can? And employees started asking themselves, well, frankly, why would I go back to my prior life? Why would I go back to being in an office every day, dealing with commuting. Who knows whether that's really a better life or not? And I think it kind of took everybody by surprise. I do think global companies thought, okay, everybody's home, but the moment that we can go back to the office, everybody's going to be so happy to go back to the office, to be with their colleagues, to hang out around the soda machine, the coffee machine. But that's actually what's not happening. And it's been very interesting to see the debate and the discussions with different companies, because some companies were actually completely convinced that this was just a pause, this was temporary, and that everybody was going back to the office. Other companies, surprisingly, very, very, very early on, and very early on, I mean January of 2021, about a year ago, they actually put in place a global remote policy worldwide, where they basically had employees sign agreements that they would not go back to the office. Now, from a financial perspective, okay, you save a lot of money on real estate if you get rid of your offices. There's no question that there's something to be gained in this dynamic. But it's been very interesting to see the different perspectives. And here I think culture actually plays a role. Not company culture necessarily, but country culture. So if I take a comparison of the two countries that I know best, the United States and France, if I knew that the corporation, the global corporation, was based in the United States, I sort of knew how they would react to this remote work thing. They'd be pretty okay about it. I'm not saying 100% okay, but they wouldn't be hostile to it. And it's normal because, as we know, many US-based companies have had employees in the United States working from wherever for a long time. It's not brand new. Okay, it was still exceptional. It wasn't the floodgates as it is now. But a lot of people in the United States lived in one location and worked in another location and would travel to that work location as needed. If I looked at a company that was based in France, it was relatively likely that they would want everybody back into the office, because that's the culture. The culture here in France is to be at work, to see people, to be involved with them, and to talk to them. And so we see that this question of for or against remote work, do we or do we not move to a remote work environment, is a question that is still ongoing. It is not resolved. But there is one thing that is for sure in this discussion, which is the culture, the corporation, all of these things have a role. Some people argue that, of course, let it be remote. It doesn't matter as long as people are performing, as long as we're reaching the bottom line, we're fine. Others argue that, well, yes, it's true. People do their day-to-day tasks. People perform the things you ask them to do. But in order to create creativity, in order to create innovation, do you actually need people sitting around the table? And I've asked myself the question over the past 2 years, how many times have I actually felt like I needed to be with people? Yeah, I can't say I have not had that thought, but I can probably count it on my fingers. So that's one of the things that's very important to think about, is that companies are going to have to manage it, and they have to manage it realizing that they are not the ones that have the final say. The idea of companies unilaterally imposing what they're going to do with respect to going back to the office or not is going to be very difficult to impose on employees, because employees are basically saying, I quit. And we know because we've heard about it in the news very, very, very often. We know very clearly about what we now call the Great Resignation. The Great Resignation. We know about talent shortages. We know about impacts to the supply chain. We know that we're going to have a problem getting people motivated to go back if we insist on going back. And it's true that as time goes on, fewer and fewer companies are actually really pounding their fist on the table and saying, we're going back no matter what. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't want to predict something that I don't have the ability to predict. But there is one thing that is for sure, is that number one, employees want flexibility. They actually, surprisingly, want totally different things. They don't really care about security and employment. They don't believe that anymore. That's what their parents believed, that they would be able to devote their time working for a company and they would be able to stay forever in that company. Well, in fact, they're not caring about that. They want projects. They want short-term work. They don't care about leaving a job to go to no job. They don't want to be slaves to an employer. So it's difficult to imagine how you're going to attract them, how you're going to retain them. For example, long-term incentive plans. I'm not sure they work for the Generation Z. I think we need to find other things. For example, one of the things that I have seen that I find particularly interesting is to offer employees that after being with the company for, let's say, 3 years or 4 or 5 years, the company will allow them a 6-month sabbatical to go off and do something different, sometimes with no pay, sometimes with 50% pay. And what always astounds me about French employment law is this has been French law forever. French law forever has said that employees with a certain years of service have the right to ask an employer for a year of sabbatical. So here we are in that same configuration again. So these are the kinds of things that we need to bear in mind. We have to understand very, very acutely that the workforce is different. The workforce has changed. And global companies have to think with a new lens. They cannot continue to think pre-COVID, because if they insist on thinking pre-COVID, they may wind up not being competitive. They may wind up not being the fittest of all companies. So these are very, very, very important issues. They're HR issues, but as we'll see, there's also legal components to many of these issues. And the last point I want to make before going on to speak about some of the other key legal issues is ESG. Not only do employees want flexibility, but they want to know that they're working for an employer that has the values and the purposes that correspond with their values and purposes of life. So you may not know what ESG stands for: environmental, social, and governance, okay? It's like corporate social responsibility, for those of you who knew the old label, but it's a similar concept. The idea is sustainability. The idea is doing well by doing good, making sure that your assets of today, if they're handled in the right way, can continue to be assets of tomorrow. And if we speak specifically about human assets, it's about treating your workforce in a way that is going to help them continue to perform at the highest levels if you take care of, quote unquote, the body, the physical body, the mind. So it's very important to be thinking about this in terms of the way you treat human resources. And of course, DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are fundamental pieces of an ESG agenda. So overall, employees need both. They need to understand what the company stands for. They need to understand the purpose of the company, so they feel like they're having a purposeful, meaningful engagement with their job, but they also need to have some degree of flexibility. I'll stop here just for a moment in case anybody has a question. Okay, we would be at slide 4. We were putting up the slides. So now let's get into a little bit of, let's say, detail, okay? Things are a little bit more technical, but I won't get too technical, okay? So when I think about the impact of COVID, and I know we speak about long COVID, usually it's about somebody's health condition, but I think many of these issues, the ones that concern me and that interest me, are the long COVID HR legal issues for companies, okay? These are things that are not going away tomorrow. They're probably going to stay. So there's basically 7 of them that I want to discuss with you, okay? The first one really gets to a question about global labor and employment laws. So as many of you may know, French or EU labor and employment law is really quite different from US style employment laws. French, European employment laws are very employee focused on rights, on protections, on making sure that employees are protected in different situations. There's a lot of legislation around working time. There must be an employment contract in place. Employees are protected against unfair dismissal. The health and safety of employees is very much protected. So these are things that every employer here in Europe is well aware of, and global companies, of course, now understand that. But let's say the 2 very important key features that are really distinguishing US from, let's say, French employment law is collective bargaining and consultation rights. So with respect to collective bargaining, in France, it's very commonplace, as in most of Europe, for there to be sector-wide collective bargaining. Okay, that means that all companies that fall within a certain sector of activity, they all have the same collective bargaining. Now, for those of you that don't have a background in labor and employment law, it sounds a little strange in a way, because you may say, oh, that's like anti-competitive. That's like, you know, antitrust violations. But in fact, it's not in Europe, because even though there's the Treaty of Europe, and there's an exception in Article 101 that is very specific about saying that sector-specific collective bargaining is not a violation of competition laws. So you have this very important feature here in Europe, which you do not have at all in the United States. You might have a unionized work environment, okay, but not necessarily something that goes across. And the second point is consultation. We have works councils. We have European works councils. We have different kinds of elected bodies that are going to have to be engaged with in deciding key issues for a company. And I thought many years now, whether these laws are going to diverge or converge. I've been a big believer in convergence, okay? But the convergence, as I've seen it, has more often than not been a convergence by an influence of US labor and employment law coming over to Europe. For example, harassment laws, discrimination laws, whistleblowing. These are features that were really not taken seriously at all in Europe, specifically whistleblowing, because of the history on this continent from World War II. But slowly but surely, you know, the Me Too movement, the EU directive on whistleblowing, slowly but surely these US labor and employment law concepts have made it across to Europe and are now part and parcel of European laws. But I think with COVID, we're seeing the tide turn. We're seeing some influence of French European employment law kind of moving over to the United States. And we see this with the complexity, the idea that US employment law is starting to be less binary, if I can call it that, meaning you have employees and employers and that's it. It's starting to be more complex. In France, we have the employees, we have the employers, we have the labor inspector, we have the occupational doctor, we have the Social Security Administration, the Anti-Discrimination Agency, the Data Privacy Agency, works councils, health and safety committees, of course, the courts. So you have a myriad of actors, what I would call multiple players that are involved, that make for even greater complexity in relationships. In the United States, which has more often than not been viewed as, from my perspective, as binary, the employer and the employee, you now are starting to get some of these additional other actors. Now we've had the EEOC, the Equal Employment Commission for a long time. We of course have the US Department of Labor, but we're starting to get some union activity. And I think global employers need to be very attentive to this. Okay, we see it in Starbucks, we see it with Amazon, we see it where there are different companies that are starting to have some activity. So this is a very important thing to focus on. The second point, which I'll treat together with the third point in the interest of time, is, as I said earlier, this idea that employees now need to have flexibility and purpose. So it's not just about money. It's about what is the quality of my work and how am I going to have a job that provides me purpose. The fourth point is about the continued unfortunate erosion of civilized discourse, I would like to say. In other words, we are seeing a politicization of the workforce. Okay, we are seeing a lot of polemic. We're seeing a lot of hostility, a lot of violence in words on the social media. And all of this is starting to seep into the workplace, even if that workplace is now virtual, because it's going through the different social media outlets. And this is a problem. This is a problem because it could have issues on how far can an employee go on social media? What do you do if they surpass the limits? Is there a privacy invasion here? How do you protect data? So all of these issues around political discourse and employee infighting, let's say, in this world of fact versus opinion is something that is very important to bear in mind. The next point, which I'll go into a little bit later, is the enhanced risks, both legal and tax, in compliance and the compliance challenges, especially related to remote work. The sixth point is about what I see as a continuation of transformations, of restructuring, and of M&A activity, which will continue for sure. And finally, I wanted to say a few words about the EU and its continued quest through the EU Parliament and Commission in order to create even greater protections for all workers across the board. Okay. So let me come back for a minute and talk about some of the legal complexity. Okay. And here I'm coming back to the remote workplace. Now, as a labor lawyer, actually, I don't think I or anybody else really sat and thought before COVID about how complex it could be for people to work remotely. And as we think about it, the place of work happens to be very legally and tax charged, let's say. In other words, when your place of work is defined, let's say, as at your office, let's say that office is in Paris, France, or in New York City, or in New Delhi, wherever that may be, the office, that is going to define the laws applicable to your employment contract. That's going to define the whole series of employment laws. That's going to define Social Security rules, whether you have to pay into a system, whether you're covered from unemployment, whether you're covered in terms of pensions, whether you're covered if you get sick. It's also going to impact where you pay taxes, which is your tax home. So all of these things make it so that the place of work is like the foundation for many, many, many of these different types of laws. Not to mention, or forget to mention, immigration. That's where you're supposed to have the permission to work if you're a foreigner. So when you change this foundational principle in all of these different laws, when you start saying, well, people can work wherever. It's true, the United States is almost an island, except for Canada at the top and Mexico at the bottom left. But when you're in a European environment, it's very easy to be in another country. It's very easy to decide, oh, I'm going to work in Florence, Italy. It's very easy to say, oh, I can pop into the office Tuesday and Wednesday in Paris, and then I can go to Barcelona for the rest of the week, and I can remote work from Barcelona on Friday and on Monday. So when you start dissecting things, and when you start creating not only remote work, not only hybrid work, but cross-border, cross-country, let's say, remote work, the issues actually get quite complex. So with respect to labor and employment law, you have to start thinking of, as I said, what is the applicable law? Where do you actually work? What are the laws that are going to govern your employment relationship? What are the rules around the cost of remote work? If I'm using more electricity because I am now working from home, what are the rules and in which country apply to decide whether the employer has to reimburse me or not? Does it matter if I was the one that wanted to work from home or whether it was the employer who wanted me to work from home? What about reimbursement to employees for the use of their home? Somebody who is working in their dining room or in their kitchen or in the guest room, they're probably using maybe 10%, maybe 25% if they have a small apartment of their living space to work. Does the employer need to reimburse them for this occupational use of their home as an office? What if you have a work accident? Is working from home and falling at home because you trip over an electric wire to charge your computer considered to be a work accident? And how does an employer control that risk? Do they come into your home and do an audit and give you a stamp of approval that your home is safe for work? How do you manage that issue? Data privacy and protection and corporate secrets. What if my partner works for a competitor and they hear me on the phone all day long talking about different things? I've heard one of my clients talking about the fact that they had to do a 2-hour meeting in the bathroom of their house with the door closed because they couldn't have their spouse listening to what was going on. So it sounds very funny, but these are true issues. These are real issues with respect to how do you ensure that there's data privacy protection, especially when there's company secrets. But if you go back to hybrid work, how do you control non-compete clauses? What is the geographic scope of a non-compete clause when I spend part of my time in France and part of my time in Italy? Does the law of either country, whichever one would apply, allow me to cover both jurisdictions, or would a judge say it's too broad? Working time. How do I know when somebody's actually working? We know that one of the reasons that employees today are demanding so much flexibility with respect to when they work is because they have learned a new way of working. They're very happy, for example, to wake up, be at the controls, let's say at 6 o'clock in the morning, work really hard until 9 o'clock, and then go out for a run until about 10, and then work again until about 1 o'clock, and then maybe go do some food shopping. Okay, it's a combination, it's a mixture of personal time and work time, but that works for a lot of people. And to be honest, since a lot of people, even pre-COVID, were working incredibly long hours, it's not really such a change, or it's not such a worse change. It's maybe a better change. But when you are paying people by the hour, when you are paying them overtime, how do you control that? You cannot have somebody sitting on their shoulder making sure that they're working all the time. So I've had a situation where the labor inspector came and asked for records of working time of employees. And it was amazing when you looked at the IT information. There are many employees working 15 hours a day. We know they were not working 15 hours a day, but how are you going to prove that they were not when they're working remotely? And then, of course, can you make them come to the office or not? Do you have to pay for them to come into the office? Do they have the right to have lunch tickets used when they're working from home? These are just some examples. I can go on and on and on and on talking about all these different labor and employment law issues, but they're huge. Social Security, as I said, contribution. What country is the coverage country? Pension rights, unemployment rights. Taxes, corporate taxes. Are you creating a permanent establishment risk for the corporation because you're working in another country? Where are you paying your regular taxes? And of course, immigration compliance. So I just wanted to give you a little sense, let's say, of some of the key issues that we are seeing with respect to how are we going to manage this remote or hybrid workplace going forward. And again, I behoove global employers to be open-minded about it and not say no. And just to conclude, I wanted just to mention some of the items on the EU agenda, which I think are very important because they seem to focus, again, on employee protections. So I'm not taking this in any particular order, but well, yes, let me try to stick to the ones that I think are the most important ones. Well, we know the GDPR, General Data Protection Act, has been passed and it's active, as is the whistleblowing directive. But the ones that are on the table to be discussed very soon. Number one, platform workers. The number of platform workers is explosive. In 2020, in Europe, there were about 28 million platform workers, and that is expected to grow to 45 million in 2025, working out of 500 different platforms throughout the EU. The question is, are they really self-employed? Certainly some of them are. Certainly some of them work when they want, they don't really have a boss, they do what they want, they're sort of like the Uberized gig workforce, let's say, but others are not. Others are actually under the control and they should be considered as employees. And if they are considered as employees, they should be entitled to rest time, holiday time, sick leave, paternity leaves, unemployment, pension, etc. So what the EU is looking to do with this directive is to create a single set of criteria for when somebody is and is not an employee. What we are seeing is an explosion of litigation throughout Europe with respect to this issue, and that is what the EU is trying to prevent, so that everybody will have a clear understanding of when is a platform worker an employee and when is the platform worker not an employee. We have these issues in California, of course, with the ABC test, which is still being challenged throughout the California courts. So this is an issue which is a global issue, but we don't know if we're all going to come to the same definition of what is an employee. The other thing I want to mention in this regard is what I call algorithm management, okay? Which is a very interesting concept. At first, I wasn't sure what it meant, but I did some research on it. And okay, maybe a platform worker does not have a human person that they report to. Maybe they don't have a real subordination with another human. But if there's an algorithm that is tracking everything they do, tracking their performance, tracking exactly when they accept to work, when they don't accept to work, it could be that this algorithm is acting as a hierarchical supervision. And so the idea is to create transparency around algorithm management so that it cannot conceal what is really employment status. In that regard, we also are going to have certainly a directive on Artificial Intelligence Act, challenging the question of who is responsible for what a non-human does. Is it the owner or is it someone else? How are we going to manage that? The right to disconnect, something clearly near to my heart, because when the French first voted the right to disconnect law for employees, well, everybody kind of rolled their eyes and were like, okay, well, those are just the way the French are. But in fact, I think it was avant-garde-ish on their part, because we know now more than ever, we all need the right to disconnect. We cannot continue to be 24/7 connected to our computers, even if we're working from home. And there are now 6 countries that have moved in that direction: Italy, Spain, of course, France, Ireland, Portugal, and even Ontario. So this could be sort of a move towards the right to disconnect for everybody so that we can have enhanced mental health and less stress for employees. There may be a minimum wage directive that gets voted on. There will be an equal pay reinforced directive in order to try to close the gap on the 16% that continues to exist between wages for men and women. And I will close with a very, very important directive, which is called the Corporate Due Diligence proposal. It doesn't sound very labor law oriented, but it is. Because what this directive is going to say is that you, global company, you're responsible for your entire supply chain. Anybody along the path that adds value to the goods and services that you are selling, you are responsible for avoiding human rights violations. You are responsible to be sure that there is compliance with the basic principles of international human rights. So you can no longer hide behind the fact that it's not me, it's somebody else. So this corporate due diligence is going to be rather powerful because it will not only impact, of course, EU-based companies, but it will also impact companies operating outside of the EU if they are infusing goods and services into the EU market. So I see that we're moving along with time and that we only have about 12 minutes left. So I wanted to take this moment just to sort of tell you what I think really needs to be very, very powerful on the HR agenda for companies. New ways of working and innovation. This is, as I like to say, everybody remembers Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol used to say, everybody in life has 15 minutes of fame. Well, this is the 15 minutes of fame of international labor and employment lawyers and HR professionals. This is about how HR is going to find a way to attract talent, retain talent, give them jobs that will make them stay as long as possible. Because we need to be focusing on the bottom line. We really do. And all of these HR programs, all of them, including ESG, including DE&I, they all need to be focused on getting employees to perform to the best of their ability with a certain degree of happiness in the way that they do their work, okay? In order to get them to be committed and engaged workers. Of course, the values of the company need to be clear. And, it's top down. Don't put anything on paper that you're not sure the C-suite is not going to support, because that's the only way you're going to have the credibility to get people, especially the younger generation, to be engaged and want to work really, really hard to make the company as successful as possible. So new ways of working, we need to be creative. We need to engage workers. It's key. We have to be true to values of ESG and DE&I. And compliance is going to be more and more complicated because there's going to be a lot of restructuring. You can be sure of that. A lot of M&A activity, a lot of combinations, a lot of spins, and we need to be strong so that we can be flexible and be able to pivot and adapt to what will be our long COVID working world. So with those comments, I see that there's some questions in the chat.
Yes, there are 3 questions. Yeah.
Would you?
So if you can see the questions, Rosalind, I request you to take them one by one. We have about 10 minutes remaining.
Sure. So the question, let me make sure I'm understanding the question. So if I can try to, let me just look at all the questions first.
Yep.
Okay, so let me take the last one first, to tell you the truth. Can we have some light on women's rights in global corporations? My thinking, very personal to me, is in global companies, women have a great, great chance to be recognized for their merit. Okay, that's a very, very important point. And so I do think that it's not a negative at all to be in a global company. It's probably a positive. Okay. Now, with that, I can't help but think about what does it mean to be a remote worker and be a woman? Does that help you or does that hurt you? And I'm leaving off the table taking care of children because I actually think that fathers and mothers should equally be taking care of children. So let's say the burden would be shared. The question is about at work. We still see a 16% pay gap. And what we are seeing, at least with respect to legislation in different countries, for example, in France, is the pressure is getting stronger and stronger. So by 2029, I know that's far off, but by 2029, we're going to start seeing significant pressure for all high-level executives in French companies to be a 40-60 split. And it's going to be accompanied with a 1% penalty of the total workforce compensation. So the idea of edging companies to do the right thing is sort of slowly coming to a close, even in Europe. And we are really starting to see more women at the top. And of course, the most interesting point for me on this is that women at the top are not hesitating to surround themselves by other women at the top. In the old generation, you'd have a woman, she still surrounded herself by men. Now we're having women surrounding themselves with women. So I am feeling quite optimistic. And I can tell you every day it's better. It's much better than, let's say, when I first started practicing law. So I think we should be confident and continue thinking in terms of women's progress really being really very, very good. Now, with respect to the US and the EU, I practiced law in the United States for 10 years before moving to France. And the reason I went into labor and employment law in particular was because they were so different. I cannot even tell you how different they are because the very beginning is really a cultural distinction. In the US, and again, the US is difficult to generalize today because the US has federal laws which govern all of the United States. So for example, all of the civil rights legislation that came out, like age discrimination, sex discrimination, race, national origin, religious discrimination, all of these laws are federal. So they're common in all of the United States. And basically, based on these federal laws, if you are being mistreated because you are part of a protected class, then you have protection. But if you are not a part of a protected class, let's say you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man, there's little that could be the basis for discrimination against you. So you don't really have any particular federal protections. Having said that, states, each of the 50 states, they can pass other laws that are protective. Like, for example, California, as I said earlier, has the ABC law, which is extremely protective of gig workers, whereas Texas and Florida are not very protective in general. Some states may have laws on unfair termination, others don't. So the United States, even if we like to think of it as a country, in fact, it has become more and more of a mosaic because there's more and more friction between different states. We see this politically also, and this reflects itself in labor and employment laws as well. So you have to be careful when you're looking at it. But overall, because EU, of course, is a variation on the theme. So when you get into the details of EU and the US, it's actually really a lot of small differences in the two different continents. But overall, the US really doesn't protect employees. You know, you don't have any rights to vacation. You have maybe a fixed number of sick days. And this always makes me think how my French colleagues always say to me, well, how do you know in the United States how many days you're going to be sick? How can I have a certain number of sick days? Maybe I don't need any, or maybe I need a lot if I'm not doing well. So the whole idea of rights of workers and having a social network is so dramatically different. But I see that the person asking the question is from South America. And I can tell you South America is really much closer to EU law. Okay, South America law really tries to protect much more. And Asia is a little bit of a mixed bag. Some countries, believe it or not, are quite close to protections of Europe, like China has done quite a bit, believe it or not. Japan has done quite a bit, believe it or not. But not all of them. Some of them remain still very, very liberal, more or less an American style labor and employment law country. And did I miss a question?
Yes.
I don't know how to answer your question because I don't know in what jurisdiction you are, okay? But you'd have to take a look at the different whistleblowing laws that exist in whatever country you are and see whether complaining about unsafe work is a protected complaint, which could protect you from labor and employment law retaliation, so to speak, in your particular jurisdiction. Gurpreet, I think I've answered all the questions.
Oh, you've answered all the questions. Okay, great. And we've done this in time. We just have 2 minutes to go. So thank you very much, Rosalind. That was a very, very useful, very insightful, and a very simple to understand talk by you. We are grateful. And I made several notes, but I think there's no time for me to go into it. But just to say that artificial intelligence and employment laws, right to disconnect, social media penetration, and how that affects the employees and their rights, whistleblowing, particularly in developing countries like India and anywhere else. I think these are all very interesting points. And thank you very much. I really appreciate this talk from all of us at WLA. And those of you who are listening in, thank you very much for joining. We will be sharing this video across our different platforms that you connected with. Please do watch it there and share it with your friends and followers and colleagues. On that
I think there's another question.
Okay. Yeah, we do have time, a minute more, yeah.
No, I don't. I thought I saw another question come up, but I didn't see it.
1 minute.
No, it was a thank you. I want to just take the opportunity to thank all of you for listening, and very happy to share my thoughts with you. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn or through other methods. So it was great to spend this time with you. Please stay safe and have a happy new year, despite the difficult year we may have again, but hopefully it will be better than last year.
Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.